Parched, The Art of Water in the Southwest is an exhibition that looks at the complex relationship we have with water in the face of climate change. So essentially, 9 Arizona-based artists came together and created an exhibition, a body of artworks that reflects diverse perspectives informed by scientific inquiry, that reflects the deep complexity and challenges we face with water. This exhibition comes out of the past arts and science collaborations by the Flagstaff Arts Council. So by bringing together the arts and sciences, the idea is that a group of artists spends a week learning from water experts, policymakers, conservationists, scientists on the topic, in this case, water.
I was invited into this project by the Arts Council as a scientific expert and leader. And I was tasked with the stakeholder group or the steering committee, to design a boot camp. So I had 1 week to figure out how to teach a group of artists as much as I possibly could about water in the Southwest. We decided to find sites that were visually compelling, that brought up the conflicts and trade-offs around water issues. And so rather than have an in-class curriculum, we decided to base it more on field trips.
So we went on these field trips all over northern Arizona and down into the valley, sort of tracing the path of water. The boot camp was in January 2019. There was a lot of snowfall, so thinking about the snow starting in the peaks and running downhill.
We started up high in northern Arizona. We went to the reservation. We went to see the Glen Canyon Dam. We talked about hydropower. We came down to see Fossil Creek. We saw disturbed habitats. We saw restored habitats. We went to a wastewater treatment plant. We visited the Central Arizona Project. So we went to, a week's worth of sites, all of which depicted many of the trade-offs and conflicts around water issues in the Southwest.
I think a lot of the artists really responded to those conflicts and the contrasts and the disparities that was, I think, presented by seeing those elements back to back. In the space of 5 days over a large geographical footprint, we were really able to see the path that water takes and how many inequities are part of that. Parched conveys an urgency that I feel is really at the core of this project. It's not smooth. It doesn't flow consistently. It has a weight, it has a feel. I think there's also some element of surprise of how little reference to actual water there is in the exhibition. And through that disparity, I think that's what the artists took away. Water is so precious. It's such a resource, and its value is so important that the way they show that is through largely the absence of water. When you combine the arts and sciences, the art is able to tap into those emotions. And I think it's those emotional triggers, if you will, that really ask the viewer to look more deeply and to think about what their own response is, and hopefully motivate them to seek out more.
So I think I'll start with my piece, Groundwater, which is a fountain, like a fiberglass fountain. The fountain, instead of flowing with water, the idea is that this is flowing with sand instead. Because I'm hoping that people connect with all of their emotional connotations that they have with water, how they find it relaxing and comforting. And then I love the way that sand contrasts that. It's a little, you can taste it in your mouth when it moves around, and it doesn't sound the same. The title Groundwater is a bit of a pun, right? But there's also a little bit more of a direct reference to some of the stuff that we learned in the boot camp. A lot of laws and traditions around water in Arizona are really strange, really backwards. And one of them is this weird bifurcation we have in our laws between the way that groundwater is managed and the way that surface water is managed. Like, that's one of the things that I kept coming back to as so counter to even you know, like, not even modern understandings, but like we've known that for a while, that groundwater and surface water are linked, but we treat them as totally separate entities, and that causes a lot of conflict. And so I wanted to speak to that conflict a little bit. Floodlines is a piece which is a installation in the gallery here at the Coconino Center for the Arts. And early on I started envisioning, like, what would it look like or feel like if we filled up the space so that it, you know, filled up with water. And so this piece, Floodlines, marks a series of lines on the wall inside the gallery at different heights. And the idea is that those mark different levels of water that would fill up the volume of the space. And the difference between those lines is that they reference different dollar amount, the purchase amount of water. So every line is $100 of water. But the reason they're different is because you can buy them at different rates. So $100 worth of water from the Central Arizona project to be used for agriculture, you can fill this gallery space up to within a foot of the ceiling. But if, say, for instance, you're hauling water onto your rural property on the Navajo or Hopi reservation, you can maybe stand in an inch of water. Like, you know, it might get the bottom of your feet wet. I mean, embedded in the difference between these lines is a pretty deep inequity. One of the implications of the piece is seeing that inequity and feeling that inequity. And that price affects the way that you use it, like how careful you are with it. And I don't blame anybody for that relationship. Like, that's one that we all have. I'm arguing that our world is really profoundly impacted by the way that humans, like the way that we're impacting it through the things that we consume, and then ultimately throw away or discard. And that word consumption, parched, is particularly apt for the way that we deal with water. Like, that's really the way that we think about water. Water should be more expensive. It needs to be costlier, especially for those industries that use it most heavily. Agriculture is the #1 user of water in the state of Arizona because it's so cheap and our laws are so loose. So there's no incentive to be conservative with it, and that's causing some really severe problems. So water needs to be more expensive than it is.
When Neil contacted me, he already had a clue that not everyone paid the same price for water. And so the Central Arizona project, which brings massive quantities of water to Phoenix and Tucson, has a differential pricing scale. Ag is the lowest, agriculture uses, and I think it's still about $80 an acre foot. Municipal and industrial, they're up over $100 an acre foot. I don't know what the current is, maybe $120 in that range. For our residential water that I'm paying in Flagstaff, we pay $1,000 an acre foot. Well, if you live in the Navajo reservation, you have to haul water. The price of your water includes your pickup truck, your travel distance, your time, to fill maybe a several hundred gallon container, and you use it very carefully.
Water pricing is based more on how different groups of people have been able to negotiate contracts rather than because water has a universal price.
Yate she kli benali dashijine torichini shabashichin aro nakadine dashanella shama a beathachi aro beathachi dashe tithajin de nasha aro kinflanishahwan. My name is Klee Benali. I'm originally from Black Mesa on the Diné or Navajo Nation, and currently I reside here in Flagstaff, Arizona. So I created 2 lenticular pieces for Parched, and lenticular imagery is really basic, like 3D optical illusion. The ma'i is part of our creation history where the ma'i or the coyote stole the babies from the water, and that precipitated a mass flooding. And so that world, basically we had to leave because of that treachery. And we have an attorney working at the Navajo Nation, and for many years, water warriors, water protectors have been fighting to address what they see as his duplicity in selling Diné people or Navajo people short from our inherent right to water sources. And our peoples, don't want to just settle for small drops. We want to make sure that, we have right and access to what we are entitled to based upon, one, this is our ancestral homelands and nobody owns water, and two, if you're going to manage water on that level, negotiating it for unsustainable metropolitan areas shouldn't be part of that. And so many of my elders, many of the organizers called Stanley Pollock the new Ma'i, the person who is this duplicitous lawyer who's selling our people short for our water rights. And it says to e ina, which means water is life on the other side. And it's sort of splattered in blood to be a little, I guess, sensational, because water is life, but it also means death if we're really looking at the fact that if we don't have water, we die, especially in the arid Southwest, where we are literally dealing with droughts. Over 30% of the Navajo Nation, as well as the Hopi tribe, don't have access to running water. 22 wells from the EPA have been closed because of high levels of radioactivity. And on top of that, we're facing climate issues and extractive industries that are depleting our water tables or polluting our water sources. So our springs are drying up. And so all of the pieces that I created here have some representation of the conflict that we have, not just regarding water, but regarding existence and the challenges that we have for our survival as human people.
So my first work, and still current work, is looking at water issues out on Navajo. Many people, they estimate 30% of the homes don't have running water. And so people rely on all kinds of different sources. The difference between regulated and unregulated wells is that regulated wells or water is tested periodically by a government entity. That typically is the water that is pumped into folks' house. You think of it as tap water. Unregulated wells, on the other hand, are not tested regularly, and they are not meant for human consumption. Out on Navajo, those wells are supposed to be used for the livestock and so forth, but because of the infrastructure issues, people, if it's convenient, will use those unregulated wells. They'll say, grandma's been drinking from this well forever, it's fine, the water tastes good, that type of thing. Arsenic and uranium can be high in some of these wells because partly the underlying geology. So the Colorado Plateau was a place that there were higher levels of uranium in the ore, so that's why it was mined. And as a result, then that also can affect the wells or the aquifers that are underlying that geology. And so depending on the depth of the well, depending on which aquifer it's drawing from and so forth, there can be higher levels of uranium and arsenic.
It's a cameraless process, and I use color photographic paper, which I mount on steel plates, and I go into the water or submerge the paper under water and then expose it to a flash. And then anything that's in the water above the paper is captured as a shadow image. And once that's captured, I take them out of the water, rinse them off, hang them to dry, and then process them, and that becomes a paper negative. The boot camp was wonderful because it gave me the opportunity to see how water is used and abused in different ways throughout the state. Towards the end of the boot camp, when I heard Ernest talk about the arsenic-tainted water on the Hopi Reservation and the work that he has been doing to get filters into the homes of everybody on the reservation, I was pretty fascinated. I really wanted to see what that water looked like.
The name is Ernest Tahoe, and I work with the Black Mesa Trust out of Hopi in Kukutsmobi. In our Black Mesa Trust project, we've purchased water filters for the community members, and what these present are the images of what the water holds. And this image right here particularly is a picture of a residence home with a filter attached. So this is a picture of a filtered water here. If we move down just a little bit to this picture, this is also from a resident home, Second Mesa. This image is a non-filtered image of the water.
One of the big challenges was accessing the water. because the water is so sacred on the reservation, there's no way I could go into any body of water. Ernest and I brainstormed and came up with the idea of collecting water from filtered and unfiltered sources and then bringing it back to Tucson, where I used it in my darkroom. I just put it into a big tub in my darkroom and exposed the photograms that way. The reservations is in the United States of America, and they have water that's the quality of third world countries. So I think that's astonishing. And I hope people will support the project of helping get clean water to Hopi homes.
The filters that we have, we originally started out with a single unit. That was basically for the arsenic. But like I was saying, we did find out we had more than just the arsenic problem. We had vanadium, uranium, along with other small TDS contaminants. So we switched from the single unit to a double unit. So one of the filters will handle the arsenic problem, and the second unit to that would be the uranium filter, and that'll take care of the uranium through that.
Man, he's making things happen. I guess it takes one person to make something happen, and he's doing that right now. And you know, a lot of these homes, a lot of the families are buying Brita filters, and that's all great and everything, but really it's still not taking out the contaminants that we have in our water.
We have been looking more at uranium as more of a chemical toxicant that could potentially do damage to our DNA, that could cause mutations and move into cancer. When we drink water that has higher levels of uranium, it gets filtered through our kidneys and so then can accumulate there. Arsenic is really a bad player in the sense that it makes underlying health conditions worse. So there's a number of different approaches to treating water in order to bring it into the regulatory levels. A difficulty with uranium in filter systems is that when those filters saturate, you have this filter now that has high levels of uranium, and there are laws against transporting uranium on the reservation. And so now you have these filters that it's difficult to do anything with them. There's, reverse osmosis types of systems. They tend to need a lot of power, so that's another issue out on Navajo. Is besides a water infrastructure problem, there's a power problem, so there's difficulties there. So people are trying to figure out a solution for some of these wells that could be treated, but with some of these underlying issues, it's not as simple as putting in a system, say, in an urban area.
One of the sites that we visited was the Scottsdale Water University, and they have, a state-of-the-art water treatment plant. So they can take sewage and turn it into really very, very clean water. But what was striking about that is that they use that water, they sell that water to golf courses. And so yes, it's, from a water conservation perspective, it's a good use of reclaimed water. We'd rather use reclaimed water than pure water on a golf course. But we went there in the boot camp the day after we were on the reservation, where we were talking to families that don't have running water. It's not right, it's not fair that there's people in our country that don't have access to safe drinking water. It's not a problem that's unique to Arizona. I think everybody knows what went on in Flint, Michigan, and yet there's other municipalities that they can afford to have the best technology to clean water to use on golf courses and for recreation.
I'm from a place with a lot of water. I'm from northern Michigan. I'm from a small town called Petoskey that's on Little Traverse Bay on Lake Michigan. I come from a place that is really different than here, and I think when we grow up in a place, that's like how we set our baseline and how we perceive everything kind of after that, really. So I think that we don't think about the use of water as much. Looking at like a southwestern landscape here, we can see where all that water is. We can see it by the color of the land. We can see it by the way the landscape shapes itself. Ecosystems that are based around where the water is, where 100 yards away that ecosystem doesn't exist anymore. I wasn't familiar with that coming from northern Michigan. That was kind of a shocking. Every kind of layer of that was shocking to me as I discovered it more and more. And it was especially striking to me when I got a drone up in the air and I looked down, and you can see through sort of the color spectrum where water is being used, where these ecosystems are happening. Sometimes it would require me to, like, you know, fly over no trespassing signs, fly over private property signs, fly into gated communities. And so that's another aspect of sort of the drone that is really great in terms of, like, it gives access to spaces that, you know, we normally might not have access to. I've got 6 pieces that kind of, I feel like, showcase sort of this conflict, and it's a conflict of sort of where water use butts up against the desert, butts up against wild spaces, and where humans have kind of made these changes to the landscapes. And I think that, like, within the framework of this project, you know, it's hard to sort of understand how dry the desert is until you see water next to it. So I traveled to Yuma. You know, I found, you know, some date tree orchards. I found alfalfa fields. I traveled to west of Phoenix to some fields that are owned, they're Saudi Arabian-owned companies that grow hay for their horses. They grow the hay here in Arizona because it's illegal to grow that hay in Saudi Arabia, and our regulations are so lax that it's easy and cheap for them to grow it here. I flew over golf courses. I flew over sort of exclusive communities that, you know, kept the public out. I found myself in a lot of cases thinking about, you know, these water pipelines and the cap and the types of things that sort of crisscross our state so that we can decide who gets the water and who doesn't. We can see the water. We can see the water up against the desert. We can see the sort of stockpiling. You know, it's almost like we're stockpiling the color in the landscape, really, because, you know, when that water ends, the desert kind of drains itself of most of the color that, you know, we can see.
One of the first sites that we went to was the Glen Canyon Dam in the Colorado River, because you cannot think about water in the western United States and the southwestern United States without thinking about dams, hydropower, storage, and water allocation. And the Colorado River built the West. Cities from Phoenix to Tucson to Denver, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, all rely on Colorado River water. Colorado River water also fuels our most productive agriculture. If you're eating a salad in the winter, you're also consuming water from the Colorado River. So we were immediately confronting artists with trade-offs and conflicts. If you're prioritizing diverting water to cities for drinking, for swimming pools, for golf courses, or to agriculture so we can have fruits and vegetables all year long, well, then you're taking water from free-flowing rivers. And so it's very, very striking that we're moving water. I mean, water naturally moves, but we're allocating water to certain users and not to other users, even when it's running right through their land.
So there's something called the Central Arizona Project that was developed in conjunction with the desire to bring more water to Phoenix and Tucson, which those communities were dependent on groundwater. They've been overdrafting groundwater for years. When the Central Arizona Project moves 1.5 million acre feet, that's a lot of water a year. They have to lift water hundreds of feet out of the Colorado River, and then they flow by gravity to the next low spot, and they're pumped up 14 times. So it takes a lot of energy to move water. So again, the connection between Indigenous people living in a place for many, many generations being displaced in order to provide cheap water to Phoenix and Tucson is a thread in this story that's very important.
I live out in the Black Mesa region of northeastern Arizona on the Navajo Hopi Reservation, and I live in a place called Big Mountain. That's, you know, where my ancestors lived, and that's where I grew up for the most part, and that's where I returned to build a home. Hogan is a place of ceremony and healing. And going out the east entrance is like a new day and new beginning. And so you have a line of people out there that represents the fence that was erected on the land as a result of the so-called Navajo Hopi land conflict that happened to that community. Breaking that fence means that, like, we're trying to find sustainable ways, but also that you have to move the people. They have to be healed for them in order to move. And so when you see that vase that I'm carrying is a water vase, as you give it to the people, they come to life. It's like a seed. They represent the seed, and they go and they plant and they grow. What I'm talking about is very much connected to water and air and land and all the things around us. But when the land is being degraded because of this whole land conflict I'm talking about, was all about that they wanted Phoenix to grow into a big glamorous city. And that's what you see today. I mean, if you didn't know the history of Phoenix, you would think maybe that's normal, right? All that water that's down there, all the fountains, all the greenery. Because Phoenix, in reality, doesn't have any water. They pumped the ground a long time ago. I always say it's at the expense of, on our back, of what happened to our community. Growing up there, you used to see the community, it used to be an oasis where you could plant your crops and not worry about rain. It was alive and people were there. And today you look at it and it looks empty. It's just like people going through a war in a way. People get affected certain ways because of the conflict. So my community that remained on the land, even though people try to remain strong and resilient, it really affected them. And what if we did have water? That would be the question. This was done at our expense. That's how I see it. We grew Phoenix into what it is at our expense, and that's being parched.
By the time I was born in Phoenix, Arizona's main perennial rivers had been dewatered. The Salt River, dry, used to be a perennial river, had beaver in it. Gila River, which the Salt is a tributary, dry, dammed. We've taken water out of the river in the desert to grow crops initially, and now to replace agricultural lands with suburban development. And that sequence has come with it and has been enabled by inexpensive water. One of the reasons why the Central Arizona Project was built is the early dams weren't sufficient to keep Arizona growing, and they relied more and more on groundwater. The groundwater in the Basin Range, the kind of geologic area around Arizona, that water is fossil water. It was added to those basins at the end of the last ice age, 15,000 years ago. You pump it out and it's not replaced. That groundwater supply has now been replaced by the Colorado River to some extent through the system that I described earlier.
In my family, my mother was knew herbs. My father was a Nightway Yaibiche dancer. My mother's sister was a crystal gazer, hand trembler, and her brothers were medicine men. So all these people are gone. So all their knowledge is gone. So, and I remember some of what I've learned from them and try to work with it in my art. And so the clouds and the rain is part of it. The text, those are words for water by tribes in Arizona. We looked at the Colorado River coming out from the watershed all the way from Colorado all the way down from further north. So along the water, there's all these indigenous people. I guess just to emphasize that part of it, to say that these people have a word for water and it's sacred to them, and they're still here, they're still planting, some of them, they're still, not all of us live in cities. I try to include both northern and southern tribes, and some tribes into Mexico. Dene, Hopi, Tonatemyaki, Havasupai or Wallapai, Paiute, and Maricopa, and Tarahumara, and maybe the Pai group, Pai. There's a Pai group in Mexico. Apache, I think I said. Another thing about the water is very sacred to the Dene people. Water, clouds, wind, because the clouds in the water actually gave birth to our ancestors, who eventually created us.
So in the boot camp, we talked a lot about reclaimed water. And reclaimed water is, in ways a double-edged sword. So it's got some really great benefits, but then it's also got some concerns. Reclaimed water is water that's treated at a higher level so that it can go directly to another use. So that sounds great, and it is great, because of course we're looking to conserve water. And so if we can use reclaimed water, for example, in some agriculture or some landscaping, reclaimed water is a wonderful use of water because it doesn't need to meet the standards of, for example, drinking water. But there's issues of where and when we use reclaimed water. Snowball, the ski area that's north of Flagstaff, is using reclaimed water to make snow. But that has both health concerns, and then more importantly, it really clashes with the spiritual values of many, many tribes that see the San Francisco Peeps as sacred sites. And so as scientists, we can measure all sorts of things, but from a perspective of a sacred site, that really has almost no meaning.
So this piece is basically a 22-foot diameter circle made of steel, big trough, similar to a big circular trough you'd see out in the desert forest. This is 12 inches deep, and it's filled with thousands of cattail heads, which you tear apart and create cattail down. They're beautiful plants. They got these heads that are like big hot dogs, and you just twist them and they pop open, they explode. Whether it's cattail down or pine sap or pitch, it's all these natural materials that I used to play with as a boy up in Idaho. There was cattails, and we would take those and just fill the whole Forest Service road with cattail down. So that material is now, I'm basically playing with it again. And in the center of the circle, the axis is a black hole. And then dangling from the light above will be a cottonwood leaf. And I was attracted to the shape of the cottonwood leaf. And so I started investigating what it meant to me, what it meant to other cultures. Right up front is a place where there's water. That's where cottonwood leaves or trees grow. And now that I'm here in the Southwest, that's wherever there were cottonwood leaves, I knew there was water. So the cattail down was a perfect symbol for snow. I learned about the San Francisco Peaks and what they symbolize to the native peoples of this area. I wanted to speak about, and especially once Snowbow Corporation started getting reclaimed water from the city, effluent water, wastewater. Even though the water may be somewhat safe, the controversy for me is the symbolic nature of it. It's a sacrilegious thing to spray waste on Mother Earth. It's basically how I view it. And I don't have patience for those people, including myself, who go and justify their need to recreate.
It's a solo, mythic, poetic performance. I go through many transformations throughout this piece, and the main character of it is a large kind of reptile lizard-like character that's the protector of the water, really the embodiment of the water. The first part is the apocalypse, and that has a very dry feeling to it, where I'm really trying to get into the space of what is it like to die of thirst? What is it like if there were no water? And there's an image that I really worked off of to create that first section, which is a coyote that was in this water hole that had dried out, and it looked like the coyote just died looking for water. And it happened the very next day that there was a monsoon and the whole thing got covered with water. So what is it like to die of thirst? And then what is it like to drown? The next section, the resurrection section, is about this being underneath the water or underneath the earth that has been asleep for eons, that has been extinct for eons, and the earth is actually gone through so much destruction that it looks like just a planet of white ash. And so this being starts emerging from underneath the earth after all of the ice has melted. Then it goes into another section that's more, I really work with the image of how does water move. There's nothing quite so beautiful and smooth and continuous and sinewy as water. And so I've worked a lot with how does water move through your body, through your joints, through your muscles? And basically, how do you move your own water? We are water. That's the third section is about really embodying the qualities of the movement of water. Sean and I guess we met when this project first started. I think it was him that had the idea of me being inside of the cattail down, piles and piles of cattail down. But when we did it for the first time, it took 2.5 hours for everyone, 5 people, to cover me in cattail down, one cattail head at a time. So it could be many, many things. It could be ash, the phoenix rising from the ash. It's up to the viewer's imagination of what they see. And I think that since this is kind of a wordless process, there's going to be all kinds of interpretations of what people see. And then the last section is a ceremony with the audience about really taking water as a sacrament and looking at it as, we kind of take it for granted that you turn on the faucet and it's there. But what if there were no more water and you're holding the last water in your hands? How precious it is. I had a very powerful dream one time. A voice in my dream said, "What will you miss when you're gone, when you're dead?" And I immediately answered in the dream, water. There would be no life without water. Everything depends on water. And what is it to treat it with more respect and more care?
You know, what we've always said, water has a spirit. And most people don't think that they believe in any spirit, right? But water does have a spirit. It has a body. It can hear you, you know.
Everything we do in our culture out on Hopi is for water and to bring moisture. All our ceremonies are tied to water. Water is life, and it's very powerful if you take care of it and if you respect it.
The science is on our side in terms of like knowing what to do with the water and how to conserve it, but that doesn't really seem to matter. The science does not match our laws and habits and attitudes around water. What's happening with that disconnect? And I think that's one of the roles that art can play. I think you have to engage people through that information on an emotional level, on a gut level, before you can expect them to like make changes in their life or changes in their attitude. And so I think that's one of the strengths that art can bring to science.
Perhaps the most prominent piece that I created for Parched is a piece that I call Storm Patterns number 2. The concept here is to take a traditional Navajo rug, or at least the design of one with storm patterns, and modify that and bring it with projection mapping alive. If a rug was woven at the beginning of our time, our creation as Diné people, with a Haji net, or the creation history with Ma'i, or the coyote, as I mentioned before, who in our traditional history and our emergence stole water babies. And so what if that rug witnessed that through time, and we could witness that narrative through the sort of like weaving. And so I wanted to create that visual element that in some ways echoes, but it isn't a ceremony, and addresses harmony and disharmony. I just wanted to play with those elements to have them be represented, you know, more lively, as opposed to with the traditional rug patterns. There's actually sort of two components that complement each other. There's a projection mapped on the floor as well with a pot that holds part of that story, because the pot is a vessel that carries water, but it's filled with sand in this exhibit. And the bottom section has some of the connections to sand paintings that really are part of the narrative of the creation history for our people. Wherever there's a environmental crisis, there is a social or cultural crisis, especially for Indigenous people, because we're people of the land. So whatever you do to the earth, and it's not just a cliche, you do to us. People don't see that on the same terms here, though, and I think it's critical. It's like the fact that somebody can spray 180 million gallons of treated sewage on a mountain that's holy to 13 Indigenous nations is an extreme act of white supremacy, and just a questionable use of water, even if it's wastewater, which could be discharged back into aquifer and filtered out naturally, considering the cultural affront with the desecration and the concept of spraying treated sewage on a sacred place. And then, you know, the just use of water, just is a bad message. And so the demonstrations are from that. There was mass police repression, people were arrested violently and aggressively. And I think, like, not a lot of people see that, but I think for the mountain and for the region, Indigenous folks, it's never left our mind. And so that's part of the weaving. Some of the other demonstrations were from resistance to S2109, the Little Colorado River Settlement Act. And so there's a big banner in there that says water is life in multiple languages, in Hopi, Diné, in Spanish and English as well. This is how bad it has to get, is people actually subjecting themselves to arrest and, you know, in the fight for clean water, for access to just, you know, water to sustain their ways of life. This isn't right. Something about this is wrong, and I don't agree with this. And I'm not going to go along with your status quo, because what that means is an end for us. It's like we don't have a future without water, so we need clean and healthy water to survive. So that means, no, we're not going to go along. And, you know, I don't mind being confrontational and agitational and provocative on that level.
I think there's a lot of emotion around the water. There's a lot of anger around water. There's a lot of conflict around water that the artists pick up on. A lot of the artists really responded to our visit to Fossil Creek, which I think was it was an opportunity for them to be in the space of water, to be in this place that nature had carved. It's this oasis in the desert, and as such, it was also like a resting point or a break in all of the conflict in a lot of the other sites on the field trips. And artists responded to that in so many projects, and I think that's another thing that their art provides, is a resting point. It's like a pause. What the art asks you to do is slow down, to gather those emotions and have the space to think deeply and form your own opinions.
What we see now is a beautiful river, but for 100 years, much of Fossil Creek was diverted for hydropower production. Over 10 years ago, a group of environmentalists lobbied the Arizona Public Service to decommission the hydropower dam in operation. Arizona Public Service and the government agencies did it for the people of Arizona. They did it to provide Arizona with a second wild and scenic river. And the project was a huge success. Everything came back. It's now an oasis of native fish, native insects, birds, and people now have one more place that they can really enjoy a wild and scenic river. But central to the recovery of Fossil Creek was what you don't see. So one of the big success stories of Fossil Creek is that we brought back the algae. And I know a lot of times people think of algae as slimy, but they're also the base of freshwater food webs. If you don't have healthy algae, you can't have healthy ecosystems.
I think I was most intrigued by the idea of Fossil Creek. The whole project was about water. So I was most intrigued with this one to try to work on the notion of the restoration of an ecosystem. These are microscopic images of algae. I got some references when I was in the lab, and we were just going through the different algae that we had collected and just moving the microscope around until I saw things or compositions that I really liked, and then we were just shooting them. There's 3 iterations of this project. So originally, all I was thinking about was the idea of playing on size. So I liked the idea of working with something that was microscopic and doing them in a large format. And then when I started looking at the images through the microscope, I thought, I really want to see if I can simulate that looking into the microscope. So the bottom tier of paintings are supposed to look like a slide under a microscope. And I kept the top 3 images because in the lab, there's a certain point in time where it starts to disintegrate. So that's what I wanted to do, was to show that disintegration of the algae and then the regrowth. When I'm looking at the algae, there is so much information in there. I mean, it's just so overwhelming. And so I wanted to find a nice bridge of, does it kind of represent what I'm looking at, but still have an abstraction, an aesthetic quality to it? So trying to balance both. And I was really excited about doing this body of work because a lot of my pieces are very, very representational. And I think that the algae and the microorganisms lend themselves to something that's a little bit more abstracted. So even if I'm working representationally, it's already in an abstraction. So then I can look at how things are composed, how things are interacting, and then add that color element to it. So I hope that both artists and scientists would come in and take a look at it and get, the same type of reaction. I have a few different videos of different types of microorganisms, but for some reason this one was the most fascinating to me. It reminded me of like fly fishing because the organisms, would shoot themselves out to get their feelers out and eat and then pull back in. So it was just constantly this back and forth of movement. So, I just thought that having something in a still image, having something to match it in a movement was a nice bridge between the two. The whole watershed of the Southwest is depleting. We're losing so much, we're not thinking about how we're using the water. So I was intrigued about the idea of the regeneration, the regrowth of what water can do. So just that whole idea of being in a place that had taken down the dams and had restored a complete ecosystem was very fascinating to me. And so that's one of the things that I was thinking about with this project was, you know, I hope to extend it, but I wanted to start right at the algae level and the microorganism level, because all of that feeds into all the way back up to human life. When you're looking at something under a microscope and you can see things that are moving, that life is everywhere. I really firmly believe in when the Indigenous people talk about water as life. Then to have these things that are living within an aquatic setting, just all of it feeds into each other.
Things can reverse. Things can get better. You think that it's only going to get worse when you project into the future, but seeing Fossil Creek is like, okay, a few people can make a difference and a creek can start to flow again and we can change things.
I'm grateful and honored to be part of Parched. I think that there's an opportunity to further the dialogue around water issues, but we should not come in understanding that it's going to be a polite conversation or a comfortable conversation. And those conversations need to center the voices of Indigenous people who have a long history since time immemorial with water and with the environment, and understand how to live with nature, not just against nature. And that might mean drastically having to change what we do and not living with those same conveniences and not sustaining unsustainable ways of life. And it shouldn't mean doing that. So it's a challenge. It is a conflict. And I think we're going to continue to be parched until we actually have that real talk.
Looking to the future, I'm concerned but hopeful. The science is clear. Climate change is already causing droughts in the southwestern United States. We've allocated water into the future that we're not going to have. We want to be able to protect water uses for human needs, we want environmental justice, and we want water for nature. Something's got to give, and we're not sure what. But Parched and projects like Parched make me hopeful. I'm hopeful that people will come and see the exhibit and be inspired by the art that's been created. It will inspire them to learn more about water and to move towards more dialogue and some solutions.
When I look across the space of the completed installation of this exhibition, what I feel is pride. The artists put so much work and thought into each of their projects across so many different themes, and with all the references to conflict and disparity, I think there's also a strong sense of hope, and I think that's reflected in the level of how much they put into their projects.